Darius Knight jolted awake to find a stranger in his bed. A beautiful woman lay curled against him, wearing only his white dress shirt, her face peaceful in sleep despite the bruises darkening her wrist. His heart hammered as fragments returned. Midnight streets, desperate screams, blood on broken glass. She stirred, eyes fluttering open to meet his panicked gaze. "You saved my life," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Now I owe you everything." Darius Knight blinked hard, certain he was still dreaming. The woman sitting up in his bed wore nothing but his oversized white dress shirt, the fabric draped elegantly over her slender frame. Her composed demeanor struck him as oddly professional for someone who had just woken up in a stranger's apartment. She tucked a strand of long, dark hair behind her ear with the same precision he imagined she used in boardrooms. The morning light caught the expensive watch still clasped around her wrist, probably worth more than his monthly rent. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Darius sat up slowly, his mind struggling to piece together fragments from the night before. He remembered walking home from his security shift at 3 in the morning, remembered helping someone in distress, but the details remained frustratingly hazy. The scent of her perfume, something floral and undoubtedly costly, lingered in his small bedroom, a stark reminder that this woman didn't belong in his world of second-hand furniture and paycheck-to-paycheck living. Valentina Sterling studied his face with intelligent brown eyes, apparently unaffected by the awkwardness of their situation. "Valentina Sterling," she repeated, extending her hand as if they were meeting at a business conference rather than his cramped bedroom. "CEO of Tech Vision Corporation. You helped me last night when I was in trouble. I always repay my debts." Her voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to, each word precisely chosen and delivered with purpose. Before Darius could respond, the sound of small feet padding across hardwood floors announced his daughter's approach. 6-year-old Zara appeared in the doorway, her wild curls escaping from yesterday's ponytail, clutching her favorite stuffed elephant. She studied the scene with the unfiltered curiosity that only children possess, her dark eyes moving between her father and the elegant stranger. "Daddy, do you have a new girlfriend?" she asked with the innocent directness that made Darius's heart skip a beat. "Zara, go brush your teeth, sweetheart," Darius said quickly, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. He pulled on a t-shirt from his nightstand, suddenly aware of being shirtless in front of this poised businesswoman. His apartment, with its mismatched furniture, crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, and toys scattered across the living room, must look pitiful to someone who probably lived in a penthouse. Yet Valentina's expression showed no judgment, only what appeared to be genuine curiosity about his modest home. Zara lingered in the doorway, clearly fascinated by their unexpected guest. "Are you staying for breakfast? Daddy makes really good pancakes, but we only have the mix from the box." Her innocent offer hung in the air, and Darius watched Valentina's professional mask soften slightly. For a moment, she looked almost vulnerable, as if Zara's simple kindness had caught her off guard. The contrast between this woman's obvious wealth and his daughter's guileless generosity highlighted the vast gulf between their worlds. "That's very sweet of you," Valentina said gently, her businesslike tone warming considerably. "But I should probably get going." She turned back to Darius, reaching for an expensive-looking purse that sat on his nightstand. "I'd like to discuss compensation for your help last night. Perhaps we could meet for coffee later today? I have my assistant's card here." She fumbled through her bag, her composed facade cracking slightly as she realized something was missing. "My phone," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "And my wallet." The admission seemed to cost her something, this acknowledgement of vulnerability from someone clearly accustomed to being in control. Darius watched her shoulders tense, saw the way her jaw tightened as she processed this complication. Even without her usual tools of power and connectivity, she maintained an aura of authority that filled his small bedroom. Darius stood up, maintaining a respectful distance. "Look, Ms. Sterling, I appreciate the gesture, but I don't need any compensation. I was just helping someone who needed help." His voice carried quiet firmness, the same tone he used with Zara when she tried to negotiate bedtime extensions. He'd learned long ago that accepting money for basic human decency felt wrong, like putting a price tag on his mother's teachings about treating others with kindness. Something flickered across Valentina's face, surprise, perhaps even confusion. She studied him with renewed interest, as if he were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "Everyone needs something," she said carefully, her business instincts clearly engaging. "A better job, maybe? I have connections throughout the city, security positions that pay much better than wherever you're working now." Her offer hung between them, well-intentioned but somehow missing the mark entirely. The assumption stung more than Darius expected. He kept his expression neutral, but inwardly bristled at the implication that his current work wasn't enough, that he needed her charity to improve his situation. "I'm fine where I am," he said quietly, his pride speaking louder than practical considerations. He thought of his night shift at the office building, the way he took genuine satisfaction in keeping people safe, in doing his job well and earning an honest living for his daughter. Zara reappeared, having apparently forgotten about toothbrushing in favor of continuing to observe this fascinating adult interaction. She climbed onto the bed beside Valentina with the fearlessness of childhood, immediately comfortable with this stranger who smelled like expensive flowers and wore clothes that probably cost more than their monthly grocery budget. "Do you have any kids?" Zara asked, settling cross-legged on the comforter. "No, I don't," Valentina replied, and something in her voice suggested this was a sensitive topic. She looked down at Zara with what might have been longing, her fingers unconsciously smoothing the wrinkled fabric of Darius's shirt. "Do you like having your daddy all to yourself?" The question seemed genuine, not the polite small talk adults usually made with children. "Sometimes," Zara said thoughtfully, "but it gets lonely. Daddy works a lot." Her honest response created an uncomfortable silence in the room. Darius felt the familiar weight of single parenthood, the constant balancing act between providing for his daughter and being present for her. Valentina's expression grew thoughtful as she processed this glimpse into their life, perhaps beginning to understand that his situation was more complex than a simple business transaction could solve. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and assumptions. Here was a woman who commanded boardrooms and probably never doubted her ability to solve problems with resources and connections, confronted with a man who preferred dignity over opportunity. And caught between them was a 6-year-old girl whose innocent observations had inadvertently revealed more truth than either adult was comfortable facing. The memory came flooding back to Darius as he watched Valentina gather her composure. It had been barely 6 hours since he'd first seen her, though it felt like a lifetime ago. The fluorescent lights of the downtown office building had been humming their usual late-night symphony when his shift ended at 3 in the morning. He'd walked these same streets countless times, knowing every cracked sidewalk and flickering streetlight that marked his route home to Zara. The city at that hour belonged to people like him, night workers heading home, early risers starting their day, the invisible workforce that kept the world running while others slept. She'd been sitting alone on the stone steps of the Financial District Plaza, her expensive dress wrinkled and her carefully styled hair disheveled. Even in the amber glow of the street lamps, her distress had been palpable. Darius had almost walked past, respecting the unspoken rule of urban anonymity, but something about her posture, defeated yet defiant, had made him pause. She'd looked like someone fighting to maintain dignity in a moment of complete vulnerability, and that resonated with experiences he knew all too well. The 3 young men circling her like predators had made his decision easy. They'd been loud, emboldened by alcohol and the late hour, their voices carrying crude suggestions that made Darius's jaw clench. He'd approached with the measured confidence his security training had taught him, positioning himself between them and their intended target. "Gentlemen, I think the lady would prefer to be left alone," he'd said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to de-escalating situations without violence. Their response had been predictably hostile, sizing up his broad shoulders and muscled frame with the calculation of predators deciding whether potential prey was worth the risk. But Darius had learned years ago how to project quiet strength without provocation, how to make troublemakers choose the easier path. After a few tense moments filled with posturing and muttered threats, They'd moved on to find less protected targets, leaving him alone with the grateful but thoroughly shaken woman. "Thank you," she'd whispered, her voice trembling slightly despite her obvious efforts to maintain control. Up close, he could see that she'd been crying, though she'd tried to hide it. Her makeup was smeared, and her hands shook as she attempted to call someone on a phone that was no longer in her purse. "I can't believe I lost everything," she'd said, more to herself than to him. "My phone, my wallet, even my car keys. I have no idea how I'm getting home." Darius had stood there weighing his options, knowing that leaving her alone in this neighborhood at 3 in the morning would be unconscionable. His apartment was small, certainly nothing impressive, but it was safe and clean. Zara was spending the night at his neighbor's place while he worked, so there would be no complications with child care. Still, inviting a complete stranger into his home went against every practical instinct he'd developed as a single father protecting his small family. "I have a couch," he'd offered finally, his mother's voice echoing in his memory with lessons about treating others as you'd want to be treated. "It's not fancy, but you'd be safe until morning." The words had cost him something, this admission that his best wasn't much. But the relief in her eyes had made the discomfort worthwhile. She'd accepted with grateful tears that she'd tried unsuccessfully to hide, following him through empty streets to his modest building. The walk to his apartment had been filled with careful conversation, both of them navigating the awkwardness of their situation. She'd mentioned working late, a company event that had gone wrong somehow, colleagues who'd abandoned her when things got messy. He'd shared little about himself beyond the basic facts: night security work, single father, simple life in a neighborhood that wasn't dangerous but certainly wasn't prestigious. Their words had been surface level, but underneath lay the strange intimacy of two people thrown together by circumstance. Once inside his apartment, the contrast between their worlds had become even more apparent. She'd looked around his living space with what he'd initially interpreted as polite interest, not realizing until later that her expression might have been genuine appreciation for the warmth he'd created despite limited resources. Zara's artwork covered the refrigerator, family photos lined the bookshelf, and everything was clean, if not expensive. It was a home built on love rather than money, and perhaps that had been something foreign to her experience. He'd given her his most comfortable t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants that had been comically large on her frame, then offered her his bed while he took the couch. She'd protested initially, but exhaustion and emotional trauma had eventually overcome her objections. Before disappearing into his bedroom, she'd paused at the doorway, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You don't even know my name," she'd said quietly. "Why would you help a complete stranger like this?" The question had haunted him during the restless hours he'd spent on his couch, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. His life was carefully ordered out of necessity. Every decision weighed against its potential impact on Zara's security and well-being. Bringing home a woman he'd met under such circumstances violated every rule he'd established for himself as a responsible parent. Yet something about her had seemed genuinely desperate rather than dangerous, more lost than threatening. Now, watching her sit on his bed in the morning light, he understood why the night had felt so surreal. This was Valentina Sterling, a name he vaguely recognized from business news, someone whose decisions probably affected thousands of lives. The vulnerability he'd witnessed in the early morning hours seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the composed executive sitting before him. Yet both versions were authentic, he realized. Different facets of a complicated woman who'd found herself in an impossible situation. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent the night protecting someone whose wealth could solve every financial worry he'd ever had, while she'd needed the basic human kindness that money couldn't buy. They'd both gotten something they needed from that chance encounter, though he suspected neither of them fully understood what that meant yet. Valentina reached into her purse with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems with resources. She withdrew a sleek business card holder, extracting a card with movements that spoke of countless similar transactions. "My assistant can arrange a wire transfer by this afternoon," she said, her voice regaining its boardroom confidence. "What would you consider appropriate compensation?" 5,000? 10? The numbers fell from her lips as casually as someone might discuss the weather, revealing a world view where money solved most complications. Darius felt something cold settle in his stomach. The woman who'd been vulnerable and grateful just hours earlier had transformed back into a corporate executive, reducing their encounter to a simple business transaction. He watched her fingers drum against the card's expensive paper, already mentally moving past their interaction toward whatever important meeting surely awaited her. The shift felt like a rejection of everything that had made their night together meaningful, turning his genuine concern into a service that could be purchased and forgotten. "I don't want your money," he said quietly, the words coming out sharper than he'd intended. Zara looked up from where she'd been playing with her stuffed elephant, sensing the change in atmosphere with the intuitive awareness children possessed for adult tension. Darius softened his tone, not wanting to upset his daughter, but his resolve remained firm. "I helped because it was the right thing to do, not because I expected payment." The confusion that crossed Valentina's face seemed genuine, as if he'd spoken in a foreign language she couldn't quite translate. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same intensity she probably reserved for complex business proposals. "Everyone expects something," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of experience with human nature's transactional tendencies. "If not money, then what? A job recommendation? Access to networking opportunities? I can open doors that would normally be closed to someone in your position." The phrase, "someone in your position," hung in the air like an invisible barrier between them. Darius heard the assumption underlying her words, that his current circumstances were something to be escaped rather than respected, that his work had no inherent value beyond what it might lead to. His jaw tightened as he recognized the familiar sting of being categorized, judged, and found wanting by someone who couldn't see past his economic circumstances to his actual worth as a person. "My position?" The question emerged with careful control, though heat simmered beneath the surface. "What exactly do you think my position is?" He stood slowly, his height advantage suddenly feeling important in a way that had nothing to do with physical intimidation. Years of swallowing similar assumptions had taught him to choose his battles carefully, but something about this moment demanded he defend not just himself, but the dignity of honest work everywhere. Valentina's composure wavered slightly as she registered the shift in his demeanor. Her business acumen, honed by years of reading people and situations, finally detected the offense she'd unknowingly caused. "I didn't mean anything negative," she said, her voice losing some of its assured edge. "I just thought someone with your obvious intelligence and character might want opportunities for advancement. Most people in service positions aspire to something more." The damage was done. "Service positions," Darius repeated, tasting the bitter condescension wrapped in polite corporate speak. "Is that what you call it when someone keeps your office building safe so you can work late into the night? When they make sure the parking garage is secure so you don't have to worry about walking to your expensive car?" His voice remained level, but the words carried the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent being looked through rather than seen by people like her. Zara had gone quiet, clutching her elephant closer as she sensed the adult conversation spiraling into dangerous territory. She didn't understand the words being exchanged, but she recognized the tension that meant raised voices and hurt feelings might follow. Her presence served as an anchor for Darius, reminding him that his daughter was watching how he handled conflict, learning lessons that would shape her own understanding of dignity and self-worth. "You're right," Valentina said after a long pause, her executive confidence cracking to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. "I made assumptions about what you'd want, what you'd need. That was wrong of me." Her apology carried genuine remorse, but it felt insufficient against the weight of implications she'd carelessly thrown into their conversation. She looked around his apartment again, this time seeing it through different eyes, not as a space that needed upgrading, but as a home someone had carefully built with limited resources and unlimited love. But the moment for simple apologies had passed. Darius saw in her expression the same look he'd encountered countless times, the well-meaning surprise of privileged people discovering that those they'd dismissed might actually have thoughts and feelings and pride. Her shock at his refusal of charity revealed how thoroughly she'd misunderstood not just him, but the entire foundation of their interaction. What he'd seen as mutual humanity, she'd processed as a service transaction requiring appropriate compensation. "You think I helped you because I wanted something from you," he said, the words carrying quiet devastation. "That's what's really bothering you, isn't it? Not that I won't take your money, but that you can't figure out my angle. Well, here's something that might shock you. Some people do the right thing without expecting a reward. Some people have enough self-respect that they don't need your charity to feel valuable." The accusation hit its mark. Valentina flinched as if he'd struck her physically, her carefully constructed professional persona crumbling entirely. "That's not what I meant," she protested. But even she seemed to hear how hollow the denial sounded. Her entire world-view was built on the premise that everyone had a price, everyone wanted something, everyone was looking for an advantage. Encountering someone who operated outside that framework left her floundering in unfamiliar emotional territory. "Daddy," Zara said softly, her small voice cutting through the tension like a gentle blade. "Why is the pretty lady crying?" Indeed, tears had begun to gather in Valentina's eyes, though whether from shame, frustration, or something deeper remained unclear. The child's observation forced both adults to confront how far their conversation had drifted from the morning's tentative warmth toward something that felt irreparable. Valentina stood abruptly, smoothing down the wrinkled fabric of his shirt she still wore. "I should go," she said, her voice thick with emotions she couldn't quite name. "I've clearly overstayed my welcome." The words emerged stiff and formal, her retreat into corporate distance a defense mechanism against the unfamiliar sting of having her fundamental assumptions about human nature challenged so directly. "Why is she leaving?" "Daddy?" Zara asked as Valentina gathered her things with shaking hands. "Did you make her sad?" The innocent question struck at the heart of what had gone wrong. Two adults who'd shared a moment of genuine connection had allowed pride and misunderstanding to poison something that might have been meaningful. Darius didn't answer immediately, watching Valentina struggle with the complex emotions playing across her face. Part of him wanted to repair the damage, to find gentler words that might bridge the gap between their worlds. But a larger part recognized that this moment represented something larger than hurt feelings. It was about fundamental respect, about seeing people as complete human beings rather than problems to be solved or services to be purchased. The door closed behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through his small apartment, leaving father and daughter alone with the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the weight of opportunities that might never come again. Valentina Sterling had built her empire on information. In the glass-walled conference room of Tech Vision Corporation, surrounded by financial reports and market analyses, she found herself conducting the most important research of her career. But this investigation had nothing to do with quarterly projections or competitor intelligence. Instead, she was trying to understand a man who had shattered every assumption she'd held about human motivation and dignity. Her assistant had initially been puzzled by the unusual request. "You want me to find information about a security guard?" Marcus had asked, his perfectly styled eyebrows raising slightly. But Valentina's reputation for thorough due diligence was legendary, and within hours, a comprehensive file had materialized on her desk. What she discovered in those pages made her stomach twist with a shame deeper than any business failure had ever produced. Darius Knight wasn't just any security guard struggling to make ends meet. The employment records revealed a man who had graduated summa cum laude from the local community college with a degree in criminal justice. Academic transcripts showed someone who had maintained a perfect grade point average while working part-time jobs to support himself. Scholarship offers from prestigious universities had poured in during his final semester, each one representing a future that had been within his grasp before life intervened with its cruel timing. The real revelation came buried in old newspaper archives that her research team had uncovered. "Local student leaves university to care for pregnant wife," read the headline from 6 years ago. The brief article told a story of young love and sacrifice that made Valentina's chest ache with recognition of what she'd failed to see. Darius had been in his second year at State University, when his girlfriend became pregnant with complications that required bed rest and constant medical attention. Without hesitation, he'd withdrawn from school to work full-time, taking on multiple jobs to cover medical bills and prepare for their baby's arrival. The records showed a progression through various employment, construction work, restaurant jobs, eventually settling into security work that provided steady hours and health insurance. Then came the devastating entry in public records that explained everything. Sarah Knight, age 23, had died from complications during childbirth, leaving behind a newborn daughter and a young father whose entire world had just collapsed. Valentina pushed back from her desk, her hands trembling as she processed the magnitude of her misunderstanding. This wasn't a man lacking ambition or drive. This was someone who had repeatedly chosen love and responsibility over personal advancement. Every assumption she'd made about his circumstances crumbled under the weight of documented evidence, showing a pattern of selfless decision-making that stretched back years. Her phone buzzed with a message from her investigator. Subject currently works 2 jobs, night security and weekend landscaping crew. Daughter attends Maple Elementary, honor roll student. No criminal record, excellent employment reviews, volunteers at Community Food Bank monthly. Each detail painted a clearer picture of someone she'd completely failed to recognize during their morning encounter. The security company's personnel files, obtained through carefully placed phone calls, revealed even more. Darius had prevented 3 break-ins during his tenure, never missing a shift despite obvious personal challenges. His supervisor's comments praised his reliability, professionalism, and the way he mentored younger employees. Best hire we've made in years, one evaluation concluded. Treats this job like he's protecting his own family. Valentina closed her eyes, remembering the confident way she'd offered him better opportunities, as if his current work held no value. She'd seen someone she assumed needed rescuing from circumstances she imagined he'd fallen into through lack of effort or ability. The truth was infinitely more complex and humbling. He'd chosen those circumstances deliberately, building a stable foundation for his daughter's future with the same methodical care he probably applied to everything in his life. Her office felt suffocating suddenly, the expensive furniture and panoramic city views seeming like barriers between her and the reality of lives she'd never bothered to understand. How many people like Darius worked in her building each night, protecting her comfort while she remained oblivious to their stories? How many times had she walked past someone whose dignity and intelligence she'd never recognized because they wore a uniform instead of a suit? The investigation had revealed something else that made her stomach clench with guilt. The address listed for Zara's school placed it in the same neighborhood where Valentina had been stranded the previous night. Darius hadn't just helped a stranger. He'd potentially risked his safety to protect someone whose wealth could have solved his daughter's educational future with a single charitable donation. Yet he'd asked for nothing, expected nothing, and been offended by her assumption that kindness required compensation. She thought about Zara's innocent questions that morning. The way the little girl had offered breakfast with genuine hospitality despite their obvious financial constraints. Even a 6-year-old had shown more grace and dignity than Valentina had managed in their entire interaction. The child had seen her as a guest deserving kindness, while Valentina had seen Darius as a problem requiring her solution. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her shoulders as she stared out at the city skyline. Somewhere in those anonymous buildings lived a man who had shown her authentic human goodness, only to have his generosity reduced to a transaction she could file away and forget. She'd turned his selfless act into evidence of his need for her charity, completely missing the lesson about character that his actions had offered. But understanding her error wasn't enough. The question that haunted her as afternoon shadows lengthened across her office was whether any apology could bridge the gap her assumptions had created. How could she approach someone whose dignity she'd inadvertently trampled without appearing to patronize him further? How could she prove that her recognition of his worth was genuine rather than another attempt to manage a situation that had grown uncomfortable? The business cards scattered across her desk, connections to jobs, opportunities, networks, suddenly seemed inadequate tools for addressing what she'd broken. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with resources or influence. This required something far more difficult: the humility to admit that everything she thought she knew about merit and value had been catastrophically wrong. 3 weeks had passed since Valentina Sterling last saw Darius Knight, but the memory of their final conversation haunted her with increasing intensity. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of TechVision's executive conference room, surveying the elaborate setup for what would become the most meaningful corporate event of her career. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables adorned with white linens and fresh orchids, while a professional photographer adjusted equipment near the stage where tonight's ceremony would unfold. The Community Guardian Awards had materialized from Valentina's desperate need to address her mistake without appearing patronizing or insincere. Working with the city's Chamber of Commerce, she'd established a program recognizing unsung heroes in essential services: security personnel, maintenance workers, public transportation employees, people whose contributions kept society functioning but rarely received acknowledgement. The first annual ceremony would honor 5 individuals whose actions had made their communities safer, with Darius Knight receiving the inaugural Excellence in Protection Award. Her assistant approached with the final guest list, his expression carefully neutral despite his obvious confusion about this unusual philanthropic direction. "The nominees have all confirmed their attendance," Marcus reported, tablet in hand, though I should mention that Mr. Knight seemed surprised by the invitation. He asked several questions about the selection process and the organization sponsoring the event. The underlying message was clear. Darius suspected this elaborate production might be connected to their uncomfortable parting. Valentina nodded, her stomach tightening with nervous energy that had nothing to do with typical corporate event logistics. She'd orchestrated billion-dollar mergers with less anxiety than this evening was producing. The difference lay in what success meant tonight. This wasn't about quarterly profits or market positioning. This was about proving that her recognition of Darius's worth was genuine rather than another attempt to manage her guilt through charitable gesture. Early guests began arriving as sunset painted the city skyline in shades of gold and crimson. Valentina had intentionally invited a diverse crowd: community leaders, small business owners, educators, and city officials who understood the value of everyday heroism. She wanted Darius to be surrounded by people who would appreciate his character rather than question his presence among the successful and influential. When Darius appeared in the doorway, Valentina's breath caught in her throat. He wore a simple black suit that fit his broad frame perfectly, his confident posture speaking to someone comfortable in formal settings despite their rarity in his daily life. Beside him, Zara practically glowed in a navy blue dress with white trim, her natural curls styled into something between elegant and adorable. The little girl's wide eyes took in the elaborate decorations with obvious delight, while her father's expression remained carefully guarded. Several other honorees had already arrived with their families: a subway operator who had prevented a serious accident, a school custodian who had organized supply drives for struggling students, a hospital security guard who had talked someone out of suicide. Watching these individuals interact with the corporate elite revealed subtle dynamics that made Valentina acutely aware of the social navigation required for events like this.
"Daddy, this place is like a fairy tale,"
Zara whispered loud enough for nearby tables to hear, her innocent wonder breaking through some of the evening's formality. Several guests smiled at her enthusiasm, but Valentina noticed how some others exchanged glances that carried subtle judgment about children at professional gatherings. The contrast reminded her how many unspoken rules governed spaces like this, rules that excluded people based on circumstances rather than character. Dinner conversation flowed around topics of community service and social responsibility, but Valentina found herself watching Darius navigate interactions with various guests. He listened more than he spoke, asking thoughtful questions that revealed genuine interest in others' experiences. When a city councilwoman mentioned budget constraints affecting public safety programs, his insights about ground-level security challenges offered perspectives that clearly hadn't occurred to her before. The moment that crystallized everything came during the appetizer course. A prominent banker, slightly influenced by the evening's wine service, began holding forth about personal responsibility and making better choices in response to someone's comment about economic inequality. His words carried coded implications about who deserved success and who didn't, the kind of politely expressed prejudice that pervaded elite social circles. "Some people just need to work harder," the banker concluded, gesturing broadly with his wine glass. "There are opportunities everywhere for those willing to take them." His gaze swept the table in a way that seemed to exclude certain attendees from the category of people who worked hard enough to deserve their circumstances. The subtle insult hung in the air like an invisible barrier. Valentina saw Darius's jaw tighten slightly, though his expression remained diplomatically neutral. Other guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension without necessarily understanding its source. This was exactly the kind of moment that separated people into those who spoke up and those who remained safely silent. Darius set down his fork with deliberate care, his movement commanding attention without demanding it. "I've worked 2 jobs for 6 years, he said quietly, his voice carrying across the table with calm authority. 60-hour weeks, nights and weekends, building a stable life for my daughter after my wife died. I had a full academic scholarship to State University that I gave up to be present for my family when they needed me. Every choice I've made has been about responsibility, to my daughter, to my employers, to my community." The banker's face flushed as he realized his generalization had struck someone personally. "I didn't mean," he began, but Darius continued with the same measured tone that somehow commanded more respect than raised voices ever could. "The security guard who keeps your office building safe at 3 in the morning, the maintenance worker who ensures your elevators function properly, the custodian who creates a clean environment for your children's education. These aren't people who lack opportunities or motivation. These are people who do essential work that makes your comfort possible. The real question isn't whether they're working hard enough. It's whether the rest of us are paying attention to the value they create." Silence settled over the table as guests processed this gentle but firm correction. Valentina felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, not discomfort but recognition. Several people nodded slightly, their expression suggesting they were reconsidering assumptions they'd carried unconsciously. The banker looked genuinely chastened, his earlier bravado replaced by what appeared to be honest reflection. When the formal presentation began, Valentina approached the podium with her prepared remarks feeling inadequate compared to the spontaneous eloquence Darius had just demonstrated. She looked out at the audience, her gaze finding his table where Zara sat proudly beside her father, completely unaware that she was witnessing something that would reshape how many adults in that room thought about merit and worth. "Excellence in protection," Valentina began, her voice stronger than she'd expected, "isn't just about preventing harm. It's about creating safety for others, even when that means sacrificing opportunities for yourself. It's about maintaining dignity and standards regardless of whether anyone notices or appreciates your efforts. It's about understanding that true heroism often happens in quiet moments when no one is watching except the people whose lives you're protecting." As she called Darius's name, the applause that filled the room felt different from typical corporate event enthusiasm. People rose to their feet not out of politeness but from genuine recognition of someone whose character had been revealed through both his actions and his words. Zara clapped so enthusiastically that her chair nearly tipped backward, her joy infectious enough to draw smiles from even the most reserved attendees. Darius walked to the stage with quiet confidence, accepting the Crystal Award and scholarship certificate with grace that made Valentina's earlier assumptions about his aspirations seem even more misguided. When he spoke, his words were brief but powerful, focusing on community responsibility and the honor of being trusted with others' safety rather than on personal achievement or advancement. The evening's real success wasn't measured in applause or media coverage, but in the conversations that continued long after the formal program ended. Valentina watched guests approach Darius with genuine interest, not patronizing curiosity, but authentic respect for someone whose perspective had challenged their preconceptions. This was what she'd hoped to create, recognition that transcended charity or condescension to achieve something closer to justice. 6 months had transformed more than just the seasons. Darius Knight walked across the university campus on a crisp October morning, his security management textbooks tucked under one arm while he balanced a coffee and Zara's lunchbox in his free hand. The scholarship from the Community Guardian Awards had opened doors he'd thought permanently closed, allowing him to pursue his degree part-time while maintaining steady employment at an executive protection firm that valued his experience and integrity. The promotion had come 3 weeks after the award ceremony, when the CEO of Sterling Security Solutions, a company with no connection to Valentina's corporation, had offered him a position based on recommendations from guests who'd witnessed his quiet dignity that evening. The work was more challenging and significantly better compensated, involving threat assessment and executive protection rather than simple building security. More importantly, the flexible schedule allowed him to be present for school plays, parent-teacher conferences, and the countless small moments that comprised Zara's childhood. Valentina had become an unexpected constant in their lives, though the evolution of their relationship had been gradual and carefully negotiated around Darius's protective instincts and her own learning curve about authentic connection. She'd started by attending Zara's school events, first the spring musical where Zara played a singing flower, then the science fair where her volcano project had earned second place. Her presence had been tentative initially, seeking permission through glances rather than assuming welcome. The first real breakthrough had occurred during a Saturday morning at the farmer's market, where Darius and Zara maintained a weekly tradition of selecting fresh ingredients for their weekend cooking experiments. Valentina had appeared somewhat awkwardly, clearly out of place among the casual shoppers and street musicians, but drawn by curiosity about how they spent their time together. Zara had immediately insisted that Valentina help choose between 2 types of apples, launching into an enthusiastic explanation of their planned apple crisp project. What followed had been 3 hours of unexpected domestic harmony as Valentina learned to navigate the simple pleasure of unhurried grocery shopping. She'd marveled at Zara's knowledge of seasonal vegetables, watched Darius negotiate with vendors in a way that balanced thrift with relationship building, and discovered that happiness didn't require expensive entertainment when shared with people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Their friendship had deepened through shared experiences that money couldn't purchase, helping Zara with homework at the kitchen table, attending community center events where Darius volunteered, quiet conversations after Zara's bedtime about dreams deferred and second chances. Valentina had revealed vulnerabilities hidden beneath her corporate success, admitting to loneliness that executive achievements couldn't address, and a growing awareness that her previous relationships had been built on mutual advantage rather than authentic affection. The romantic shift had been gradual and mutual, acknowledged first through lingering glances and conversations that stretched well past practical necessity. Darius had been cautious about introducing romantic complications into Zara's stable world, while Valentina had wrestled with fears about whether her feelings were genuine or merely gratitude transformed into something more complex. Their first kiss had happened naturally during a quiet moment on his apartment's small balcony after Zara had fallen asleep during a movie night. Now, as autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet during their Saturday morning walk through Riverside Park, their relationship had settled into something that felt both extraordinary and completely natural. Zara skipped ahead on the path, her new vocabulary words from school mixing with excited observations about squirrels and changing seasons. She'd begun referring to Valentina as my almost mom, with the matter-of-fact acceptance children brought to evolving family structures. Professor Martinez says my essay about community heroes is good enough for the student journal, Darius mentioned, shifting Zara's hand-collected leaves to his other pocket. His return to academic writing had been challenging initially, but the intellectual stimulation felt like rediscovering a part of himself he'd set aside rather than lost. The essay had grown from his experiences at the awards ceremony, exploring how society's definitions of success often overlooked the most meaningful contributions. Valentina smiled, her weekend casual clothes a far cry from the corporate armor she'd worn during their first meeting. Zara told me she's writing her own story about brave daddies for the school anthology, she said, watching the little girl attempt to catch falling leaves with scientific determination. Apparently, there's a princess involved who knows how to fix computers and make really good spaghetti. The description made them both laugh, recognizing Zara's creative integration of the adults she loved into a fairy tale framework. Their conversation was interrupted by Zara's excited discovery of a family of ducks near the pond, leading to an impromptu nature lesson that showcased Darius's patient teaching style and Valentina's growing comfort with childhood wonder. Watching Valentina crouch beside his daughter to examine duck footprints in the mud, her expensive jacket forgotten in favor of shared discovery, Darius felt something settle in his chest that he'd never expected to experience again. The healing wasn't just personal, it extended to their understanding of each other's worlds. Valentina had begun using her resources differently, funding scholarship programs and community initiatives that addressed systemic barriers rather than individual charity cases. Her board meetings now included discussions about fair wages and employee development that reflected lessons learned from someone who understood those issues from lived experience. As they prepared to leave the park, Zara between them holding both their hands, the future stretched ahead with possibilities that honored both their individual strengths and their growing commitment to something larger than themselves. The afternoon sunlight caught Valentina's engagement ring, simple and elegant, chosen together during a quiet moment when Zara had been at school, and they'd both acknowledged that their separate healing had become inseparable growth. Their love story hadn't followed conventional patterns. Built as it was on mutual respect, earned through conflict and understanding developed through difference. But perhaps those unconventional foundations would prove stronger than relationships built on similarity and convenience, creating something authentic enough to weather the challenges that lay ahead. 1 year later, Darius Knight stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie with the same steady hands that had once worked security rounds through empty hallways. The navy blue suit fit him perfectly, tailored for this specific day when he would become something he'd never imagined possible, a husband again. And Zara would finally have the mother she'd been asking for in her bedtime prayers. The morning light streaming through the windows felt different somehow, charged with the promise of beginnings rather than the weight of solitary responsibility. Zara burst through the door wearing her flower girl dress, a confection of ivory silk and tiny pearls that made her look like a princess from one of her favorite storybooks. "Daddy, look," she announced, twirling in a circle that sent her skirt spinning around her legs. "Valentina let me pick out special shoes that sparkle when I walk." She demonstrated with a series of exaggerated steps across the hardwood floor, her patent leather shoes catching the light with each movement. The transformation in his daughter over the past year had been remarkable to witness. The quiet child who had once asked why other kids had mommies at school events now radiated confidence and joy, secure in the knowledge that her family was expanding rather than remaining forever incomplete. Zara had taken to wedding planning with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that this ceremony meant permanence, that Valentina would officially become part of their small but fierce unit. "Is Valentina nervous?" Darius asked, crouching down to adjust Zara's flower crown, a delicate circle of baby's breath and tiny white roses that framed her face like something from a fairy tale. The question carried his own anxiety disguised as concern for his bride-to-be. Despite their deep connection and gradual courtship, the magnitude of this commitment still felt surreal, as if he might wake up to discover the entire relationship had been an elaborate dream. "She's been ready for hours," Zara reported with the authority of someone who had been granted special access to bridal preparations. "She said the dress makes her feel like she's floating, and she kept looking at her ring and smiling. Oh, and she's wearing your mom's earrings." The last detail made Darius's chest tighten with emotion. Those pearl earrings had been the only jewelry his mother had owned of any value, passed down through generations and given to him before her death with instructions to someday share them with someone worthy of their history. The small ceremony would take place in Riverside Park, near the same pond where they'd spent countless Saturday mornings watching Zara feed ducks and collect interesting stones. Valentina had initially suggested elaborate venues befitting her corporate status, but both of them had ultimately chosen this space where their relationship had deepened through ordinary moments rather than grand gestures. The guest list included close friends, family members, and several couples they'd met through community events, people who understood that the most meaningful celebrations honored authentic connection rather than social obligation. As they walked toward the ceremony site, Darius reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. His graduation from the security management program 3 months earlier had marked not just academic achievement but personal completion. Proof that dreams deferred didn't necessarily mean dreams destroyed. The diploma now hung in his new office at Sterling Security Solutions, where his insights about ground-level protection had revolutionized their approach to client safety and employee development. Valentina had changed, too. Her corporate success now balanced by genuine engagement with community issues that extended far beyond check-writing philanthropy. She'd learned to find satisfaction in problems that couldn't be solved through resources alone, discovering that some of life's most meaningful rewards came from patient attention to individual relationships rather than broad strategic initiatives. The wedding arch came into view, decorated with the same white roses and baby's breath that adorned Zara's crown. Guests were already seated on simple wooden chairs, arranged in a semicircle around the ceremony space, their faces reflecting genuine happiness rather than social obligation. Darius recognized teachers from Zara's school, neighbors who had become surrogate grandparents, colleagues who had witnessed his professional growth, and board members from Valentina's company who had learned to respect both his intelligence and his integrity. Valentina appeared at the far end of the pathway, wearing a simple ivory dress that emphasized elegance over ostentation. She moved toward him with quiet confidence, her smile radiant as she caught sight of Zara skipping ahead to scatter rose petals with theatrical enthusiasm. The ceremony felt both intimate and significant, witnessed by people who understood that this marriage represented more than romantic fulfillment. It was the creation of a family built on mutual respect, shared values, and commitment to something larger than individual happiness. When the officiant asked for their vows, Darius spoke from his heart, rather than from prepared notes. "You saw worth in me when I couldn't see it myself," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered witnesses. "You taught me that accepting help isn't weakness when it's offered with genuine respect. Most importantly, you loved my daughter before you loved me, and that showed me everything I needed to know about your character." Zara stepped forward to present the rings with ceremonial seriousness, whispering loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Now Daddy has a wife, and I have a mom, and we're all together forever." Her innocent joy sparked laughter that rippled through the gathering, transforming the formal moment into something perfectly representative of their unconventional but authentic family story. As they exchanged rings and promises, Darius understood that this ceremony marked not an ending, but a transformation. The completion of healing that had begun with one act of kindness on a dark street and evolved into something neither of them could have imagined when they first met as strangers from different worlds.